Шановні учасники прес-конференції, прошу займати свої місця у залі, оскільки ми розпочинаємо за 2 хвилини. Пані та панове, ми повертаємося до наших обговорень і запрошуємо до третьої панелі учасників, які вже на сцені. Модераторка цієї дискусії Катріона Мердок, віце-президентка Global Right Compliance. Тема обговорень – руйнування зернової та портової інфраструктури, масштаби збитків та відповідальність. Madam Murdoch, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today. I'm Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to attempt that in Ukrainian as well. Shanovne, panie, ta, panova, panie. Yuri is giving me a thumbs up. I think that's okay for now. It's a pleasure to open this panel on the destruction of grain and port infrastructure and the scale of damages and accountability, and to be among such distinguished panelists who will be able to speak to a range of different perspectives on this topic, to the scale and pattern of damages and attacks, the prosecution and accountability for these crimes, to their impact on the civilian population inside of Ukraine, and critically, for the purposes of today, what we can collectively do going forward. From the very outset, as we've heard from the panels this morning, from the full-scale invasion, there has been a prevalence of these attacks on critical infrastructure, ranging from, as we've heard this morning, to attacks on healthcare, education, and in course across the ports, grain-related infrastructure and agricultural areas. With the generous support of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, we have at Global Rights Compliance had a critical infrastructure, starvation and mobile justice team, which has been working with the Office of the Prosecutor on exactly these crimes that the panelists here will talk about. As is very clear from this morning's sessions, these are interconnected attacks, from the attacks that have reverberating effects from energy and infrastructure, along to the attacks and the impacts that these have on grain and agriculture and the way of life inside of Ukraine. This is also an area that has been critically overlooked in previous prosecutions and accountability, making the contours of this crime challenging to investigate, prosecute, and to understand where the parameters are. GRC have been privileged and humbled to work alongside many of those on this panel in relation to particularly port-related infrastructure and attacks on grain. The use, as we have seen in the earlier sessions this morning, of high-precision weapons, and some evidence of them here in today's room, indicate a coordinated and combined and concerted attack, using both fleet and aviation forces that only could have been authorized at the highest levels of command. Just as we shouldn't underestimate the impact of these attacks on Ukraine and externally on food and critical infrastructure, we should also not underestimate the desire on the part of Russia to occupy and annihilate critical parts of Ukraine relating to ports and infrastructure. As part of our investigations already, we have already collected reams of content, rhetoric and statements of intent in a swirl of propaganda, including statements such as this: "The war for the ports will be fought without any mercy. For the Western coalition, Odessa, Ishmael are a kind of Stalingrad. Without the Black Sea ports, no Ukraine will exist. This was a position that was championed and reposted and circulated widely just 4 days after the Black Sea Grain Initiative collapsed last summer. This is what we are here to counter and to explore, and what we should be united against an unlawful aggressor seeking to destroy Ukraine's way of existence. So, without further ado, we will bring our panel together in order to unravel some of these policies and patterns and understand what we can do. I would first like to introduce our first distinguished panelist, Mr. Serhii Dakach, and apologies if I'm getting that wrong, who is the Deputy Minister for Communities, Territories and Infrastructure and Development of Ukraine. Mr. Dakach is between 2001 and 2015 has had an array of positions within the internal affairs bodies and in the investigative department of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Between 2009 and 2011, he was the head of the training center for the Community Development Mission in Liberia, and from 2013 to 2015 was the head of the operational department inside of Liberia for the UN mission. He has subsequently worked at a range of different positions within the ministry, diplomatic representation of the EU consultative missions, also positions at the National Agency for Prevention of Corruption. He has acted as the Deputy Chief of Head and Staff and Department for Prevention and Detection of Corruption. Since February this year, he serves as the Deputy Minister for Communities, Territories and Infrastructure, where he directs and coordinates activities relating to critical infrastructure, so has a unique insight into the impact of these attacks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This is probably the longest introduction of myself and the title, I would say. I even forgot about my background. Colleagues, I'm happy to be here, and it's the pleasure basically to speak with among the colleagues in this panel. We have very important topic today to discuss. I will basically brief you about the situation with the grain initiative, with the export of grain, with the losses and damages that we have in our infrastructure objects. Starting from the very beginning, I need to say that the fact that you probably know that Ukraine is one of the biggest actors of guaranteeing the global food security. And despite the fact that Russia started the war, and we have like already 2.5 years living in the war, our Ukrainian farmers, our Ukrainian ports, our Ukrainian logistical companies, and all other stakeholders, they are not stopping, and all of them are continue to work with the export of grain to the countries of all over the world. I will speak about today the figures, but the most important issue that this all work that is done, the joint work is not stopped, and this is the most I would say the unique situation, because when we were speaking about the grain initiative and about the sea corridor, that was the probably not realistic opportunity which was mentioned abroad, but it's now going on. So what I want actually to mention today, that the damages that Russia causing to the port infrastructure and to the agricultural products actually jeopardize not the only economical situation in Ukraine, but basically the food security around the world, especially in the countries of Africa and Asia, and that's we need to understand. So, going to some of the more precise details, we have more than 50 attacks of the missiles and drones to the port infrastructure, and among them we have 208 of hits which we recorded in our Ukrainian ports. We have 280 of infrastructure facilities which were actually damaged. We have 150 vehicles which were damaged, and I will speak also about the trains which are going to the ports. But another most important issue, it's about the human lives, it's about the people. So 45 civilians were injured and killed during these attacks, the people which were going to the port, in and out, or working in the ports. So that's another losses of civilians, and this is another crimes that Russia is actually doing on the daily basis. Speaking about the particular grain, we have 100,000 tons which was damaged during these last 2 years. Saying even more that if you are talking about the grain and about the ports, we have all of our ports, like our 3 deep ports of Great Odessa, including Izmail and Yuzhny, were damaged. We have the damages in port of Mykolaiv. We have damages in port of Reni. So basically, all of our ports were heavily damaged with all of these attacks. Speaking about grain, we have, let's say, lots of damages for agricultural products, specifically about grain, but also, as I mentioned, about not only about port infrastructure, I want to mention also about the transport infrastructure. I mentioned 150 vehicles, but I would mention 299 actually train wagons which were damaged. And out of this almost 300 wagons, we could actually repair and put back on the rails only 16. So it's a huge number of wagons that we are lacking right now. All of these damages, definitely, they are causing the increase in the price for the transportation, increasing insurances, and make our Ukrainian grain more costly and not competitive. And also the prices are getting higher, not only for Ukraine, which has actually get us Ukraine losses in terms of the economy, but actually brings the higher cost, bring the lower number of grain to the countries which are in need. But regardless all of this, we are working. You see these figures. Last year, we have the Ukrainian corridor starting from the August last year. So basically, we have 1 year of Ukrainian corridor which is operating right now. And during this year, we have 2,500 ships which actually came to Ukraine, exporting basically most of the agricultural products. The total number is, you see, almost 70 million tons of cargo was transshipped from Ukraine, and 48 million out of this 68 is particularly agricultural products and mostly grain. And all of these products, they actually came brought these agricultural products to the 46 countries around the world, which means actually that Ukraine remains the main of the actors, as I mentioned from the very beginning, for the food stability and food security all over the world. Lastly, I want to mention that all this work is definitely can happen and started with the support of our armed forces, with the Ukrainian Navy, with Ukrainian air defense platoons, and definitely with our international partners. We have right now help with the international financial institutions which help us to repair and restore our port facilities, because we have the losses. For example, for Izmail, we have only for the 1 billion loss is $1.6 million, and this is just the one of the main buildings which was damaged. I'm not speaking about elevators, I am not speaking about grain warehouses which were damaged within the ports. So from this perspective, we have a support from international donors, but definitely it's not enough. I mean, we need to repair and restore the facilities that were damaged, but most importantly, and my last comment will be here, is actually to support with the air defense, because wherever we can restore, the new attacks are actually coming with the new losses and with the new risks to stop our transshipment with the grain and other agricultural products. So the support with the air defense from our international partners is key, and definitely, like, second part is financial support to restore and rebuild all infrastructure, transport and port infrastructure that we have at the moment. And we are, as the ministry, like very much working actively with all of the partners to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that gives a really good scale. Thank you. Thank you. I think that gives a very good introduction and scale of what we're facing in the context of this type of attacks on critical infrastructure. What we'll do is we'll take presentations along the line, and then hopefully if we can keep to the time, we'll have some questions for our panelists at the end. So if I could move next now, please, to Mr. Toulan Pascal from Project Expedite Justice. Mr. Toulan is the Legal and Program Director at Project Expedite Justice, and he heads the program here in Ukraine. He teaches international law at the Paris Institute of Political Sciences, and is a well-known international criminal law and judicial cooperation expert. He's worked in the Office of the Prosecutor for the ICC for over 19 years, most recently as the office's Judicial Cooperation Advisor. Prior to that, he was also in the Special Court in Sierra Leone. So Mr. Toulan will speak to us today about his work here in Ukraine on this pattern of attacks. The floor is yours.
Дякую, Katriana. Вітаю.
Thank you very much, Katriana.
For having us today. I don't know if we have the presentation on. No? Okay.
I think we need the presentation, please. The PowerPoint.
Well, at Project Expedite Justice, we've been working since April 2022, immediately after the full-scale invasion, to investigate specifically attacks against the agrarian sector. And what we can say, based on these investigations that we've been conducting in support to the Prosecutor General Office and to the prosecutors of Crimea and the city of Sebastopol and the prosecutors in Kharkiv and other places, is that, like was said all of this morning, these attacks against the agrarian sector are not a coincidence. They are not a byproduct of the invasion. They are a deliberate and organized attack. Based on open source intelligence, on the satellite imagery, on documents harvested from databases like phytosanitary certificates, quarantine certificates, crew registration, license plates of trucks, grain hoppers, registration numbers, we can confirm that there's been a deliberate pattern of reappropriation, exploitation, and destruction of agrarian resources in Ukraine. There's been a pillage of food commodities, grain stocks, and destruction and taking over infrastructure equipment that started immediately in February 2022. The single objective of the different damages that I will go through now has been to deprive Ukraine from its resources and destroy its economy in all possible ways. Thank you. So there's been different patterns of damage that we have observed. The types of attacks and the types of damage largely depend on the length and the scope of the occupation and on the pushback from the Ukrainian authorities. So the pattern that has been starting immediately and that continues is physical destruction through shelling and burning. In the early days, immediately after February, you can witness theft of facilities, stored grain, vehicles, and the equipment. And then in the longer term, when the occupation became more stable, you have a system of change of legal regime in the occupied territories with new property requirements formalizing seizure or pillage, new administration, new entities that take over from former Ukrainian companies, and transferring of property to Russian parastatal or private companies. All of this happened in clear violations of international humanitarian law and the rules of occupation. Physical destructions first, which is what we've been discussing a lot today. This happened also, and this was reminded by the Deputy Minister earlier, grain contained in elevators, in warehouses, in fields, was burnt or destroyed. And what we notice is that it happened when they couldn't take it away. So if they were unable to steal it or to sell it immediately, then there was destruction. So you have 4 million tons, for instance, of stored grain that were destroyed immediately after the invasion. Elevators, transport equipment were destroyed where they couldn't be taken away. Machine parts were disassembled, they were sold, and you have a heavy loss as well for Ukrainian economy there. We just heard it before. The ports, agrarian, grain terminal infrastructures were destroyed to make sure that there would only be one way out via occupied Crimea. So you had the attacks in 2023, 24 on the ports of Odessa and the river ports of Reni and Izmail. In the same box, we can put the destruction of critical infrastructure, such as the Kakhovka Dam in June 2023. That led to very high damage for the farmers downstream due to the flooding and to the disappearance of irrigation possibilities. So this damage will last for years and years to come. Immediately after the invasion and continuing some weeks after, Russian armed forces and paramilitary groups, like for instance the Chechen Kadyrovskis, inspected and took over some agricultural facilities, and they took over the grain, the vehicles, and the equipment. They focused on large enterprises and infrastructure complex. So what they do is that the military come in, they occupy the premises, and they take over everything they can take. And then if you look at, for instance, what we've been doing and investigating in the part of Mykolaiv that was occupied only for a few months, they did some kind of opportunistic looting by individual military units as they were progressing in the area. With simple logistics, they took over the trucks that were there, they moved the grain away, and they tried to sell it immediately or to transfer it back to Russia. And they took the trucks and the machine. When there's been a possibility to stay longer, so in the occupied territories of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as in 2 raions of Mykolaiv, there's been a more elaborate system of appropriation as a way to destroy Ukraine's agrarian economy. So they took over the farms, the markets, they set up an elaborate system where you occupy the territory with the military support, and then you occupy the premises, then you set up civil military administration in the oblast, and then civil military administration starts taking decrees to actually nationalize the entities present, and then they hand over these entities to external management, in most of the cases, parastatal and Russian private industries who took over from the Russian companies. When they needed to, they took over the grain hoppers. So if you look, you have some grain hoppers that belonged to some companies before that changed. We don't know yet if they changed formally ownership, but at least they changed the logo on the grain hoppers and took it to move the grain by themselves. There's been the taking over of the port infrastructure, obviously, the Aval terminal in Crimea, the Berdyansk terminal in Zaporizhia, and in Mariupol. And of course, they organized a system of illegal export via these ports in Crimea. What's interesting is that they actually included, and as you know, this export of grain taken, pillaged, de facto, and in our view, de jure, from these occupied territories into their figures of export. So out of the 146 million tons of grain that they declare in 2023, at least 5 to 6 million tons are clearly and openly coming from the occupied territory. I'll finish with an example in Zaporizhia. So in Zaporizhia, they occupied the part of the oblast, and then they established a civil military administration. that was headed by Mr. Balitsky, who's under notice of suspicion now in Ukraine. And they set up a state grain operator, which is a parastatal company that took over in 16 branches some of the previously existing companies like Nibulon or Tesla Group, which are Ukrainian company. They took the grain that was already there, stored, they sold it, then they made sure that they obtained additional harvest and grain from the farmers under threat of confiscation, and the farmers who would play ball were they able to continue to work, or they would be coerced to harvest and sell their grain to these entities under the market prices, of course. This state grain operator in Zaporizhzhia has taken over all of the market in the oblast. The estimated production from Zaporizhzhia matches exactly the export from the state grain operator. So in light of all of this, what we are doing and what we will continue doing in support to Yuri, his team, the Prosecutor General Office, is to help with characterization of what happened. So there is change of legal regime for property administration, which is against the rules of occupation. We have appropriation of property for private or personal use, pillage. We have destruction or seizure of enemy property without military necessity. And we have the transfer of ownership of the public entities beyond what an occupying power is entitled to do, i.e. usufruct or administrative functions. And we've been looking at more than 50 companies, 100 suspects involved in these processes, networks of companies, vessels exporting it. And we've been able, together with our colleagues in Ukraine, to document 734,000 tons of grain and to provide, we hope, evidence that can stand about this. So this is a whole system that has been put in place. I'll leave this here, from the fields and lands that were pillaged all the way to the export of this grain to countries such as Pakistan, Egypt, Syria, Venezuela, for instance. So all of this, destruction, theft, and then pillage, has only one objective, which is destruction of the Ukrainian economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Pascal. I think that really does illuminate the architecture behind these attacks and gives a good insight into what is happening beyond just the kinetic attacks and more broadly. We'll come back, I hope, with time for some questions to you at the end. But next, if I could please welcome Mr. Rudra, who is the Senior Advisor of the Prosecution of International Crimes for EUAM. I'm sure many will be familiar with Mark's work. Mark is a lawyer from the Netherlands who specializes in international humanitarian law with a particular focus on the rules and conduct of hostilities. For the past 2 years, he's held the role as the Senior Advisor on Prosecutor with the EUAM, where he supports prosecutors and investigators with their work. Before joining EUAM, he worked as a military affairs department in the Netherlands Prosecution Service, and prior to that spent 15 years as an officer in the Royal Netherlands Marine Corps, including as a battalion fire support officer, air attack controller in Afghanistan, and a special forces liaison in a targeting cell in Iraq. Mark, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Catriona, and also thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me to speak on this conference, and good afternoon to you all. I would like to take this time to set out some of the legal framework and also some of the very, very practical issues concerning the investigation of attacks. And while I will try to specify this to attacks on port and grain facilities, you will probably find that most of what I will be pointing out can be generalized also basically to all kinds of attacks against any type of target. So firstly, on the legal framework regarding attacks, on the slide you can see the core rules on the conduct of hostilities in international armed conflict. They contain those rules that we've heard mentioned already a few times today on distinction, on the prohibition to launch disproportionate attacks, and on the obligation to take precautionary measures in attack. And they also include rules protecting specific types of objects. Some of them you see mentioned on the screen. Now, it's good to mention that additional Protocol 1, which is the source of these rules, was not drafted as a criminal code. So for a criminal justice response to violations of these rules, we should turn to domestic or international criminal law. So here's an overview, and it might be a bit much on one slide, but here's an overview of some of the potential war crimes related to attacks, both under Ukrainian criminal law as well as international criminal law, or more specific, the Rome Statute. It's not a full list. There are other potential war crimes qualifications, and also attacks may, sometimes in themselves or sometimes as part of broader conduct, constitute crimes against humanity or even genocide, provided, of course, that all other elements of those crimes have also been met. But I would say that this list on the slide here would probably cover around 80 to 90% of attack cases under investigation currently in Ukraine. I'm showing this to point out that there's a range of potential crimes associated with attacks that affect civilian objects. And even when objects would turn out to be, in fact, military objectives, so not civilian objects, there may still potentially be crimes related to attacks against those objects. So let me turn to some very practical aspects of investigating these kinds of attacks to show mainly that these can be quite complex. I put on the slide here 3 core questions, and there are obviously many more questions that need to be answered during the course of investigations. But I chose these because they are seemingly very simple, and at the same time, in practice, they very often pose particular difficulties. And I will briefly address each of them. So the first question is probably the most straightforward of all. What was the object of the attack? And yet we sometimes overlook trying to answer this question because we tend to assume that whatever we saw actually getting hit was also the intended target of an attack. While in fact during war fighting, there are many different reasons why that may turn out not to be correct. So, and the relevance of this, I think, cannot be overstated. Because the rules of the law of armed conflict that I showed in the beginning, they regulate not the outcome of an attack. They regulate not effects of attacks. Rather, they regulate the decision making that leads up to attacks, for which it's crucial, again, to understand what is the intended target. So the challenge really here, even though this question is very simple, the challenge really here for investigators is to understand what was the intended target, while generally there is an absence of evidence, direct evidence pointing to that fact, and knowing also that any of these listed circumstances here may have affected where that weapon impacted. I will come to this question, how to deal with that later at question number 3. So turning to the next one is the question on, was the object a civilian object? And civilian objects are not defined in IHL, but they are defined as basically being all objects not being military objectives, so negatively defined, for which the definition here is on the screen. Let's try to apply this to port and grain facilities. So when it comes to port facilities, these may be military objectives. For instance, first of all, and this is probably the clearest scenario, where such facilities are actually military by nature, if they belong to the Navy. So it's Navy shipping, it's Navy docks, it's Navy storage facilities, etc. That's obviously clear, but they may also be military objectives if their current or projected use contributes to military action. So for instance, when those port facilities would be used to either now or in the future receive weapons deliveries from supporting countries. In other cases where port facilities would not meet the criteria of this definition, they are to be considered civilian objects. And I won't go into this question of dual-use objects because Brenda Hollis already dealt with that in detail. So what about grain facilities? Well, I guess most would be inclined to say those are military objects, and so am I, just to be clear. But it's interesting to mention that there's a legal theory that considers so-called war-sustaining objects to be military objectives. These are objects that are used to, for instance, generate revenue for a country that sustains the continuation of the war effort, which thereby makes an effective contribution to military action and therefore is considered to be a military objective. Now, there are a number of countries in the world, among which some of the most powerful, that subscribe to this theory. And it's not entirely clear, but the Russian Federation may be among them. But most countries, as well as legal experts in the world have rejected that theory. So it's a minority view, really. And let's just, for the sake of the argument, say even if one would accept that theory, it's said to be limited to such objects which constitute a regular, indispensable, and principal source for directly maintaining military action. And so it seems unreasonable to suggest that grain and grain facilities in Ukraine during the current war would fit that description. So either way, conclusion is that it would be hard to conceive a different position than that grain itself and grain facilities are to be considered civilian objects. So they are civilian objects. Let's turn to this last question here, and it revolves around whether the perpetrator knew or should have known the civilian status of the object, and despite or even because of that, decided to attack anyway. It's a bit of a similar question to that first one, in the sense that it requires to get inside of the attacker's thought process, inside of the considerations at the moment of attack. So when an attack has occurred, how do we know what the intentions behind them were? Well, I put on this slide some of the types of evidence the investigator would require. But you would see, looking at those, that the complexity really lies in the fact that these types of evidence are not readily, generally at least, not readily available, especially during an ongoing war. And so in many cases currently under investigation in Ukraine, one would likely have to turn to more circumstantial evidence, such as analysis of patterns, to try to deduce, so not have direct evidence, but to try to deduce from that pattern the intent behind the attacks, which is a very labor-intensive and time-consuming effort. So I just wanted to leave you there with some understanding of the complexity of the work. It's all the more impressive, I would say, knowing this, the work that is done by the prosecutors and investigators in these cases. And I'm very interested to hear from Mr. Balyosov on the progress they've made. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruder. I think we can generally count on a Dutchman to give us a practical outline of something. So I'm delighted that we have got into some of the practical aspects, and I hope we've got time to ask a few questions at the end. But now, just to ensure we do have time, and last but by no means least, we have Yuri Beloslov, which is the head of the War Crimes Department for the Office of the Prosecutor. Many of you will know Yuri and will have worked with him intensely over the last 2 years. On a personal note, we at Global Rights Compliance have known Yuri for many years now, and really his tireless dedication to the OPG, to justice, and to Ukraine really is something to behold, and it's a pleasure for me to make this introduction. To give some background, for Yuri. He's been the head of the War Crimes Department since 2022, I believe, but he has worked in the field of human rights and justice with extensive experience in governmental bodies, international governmental bodies, and other organizations. He holds a Master's of Sociology and Law and a PhD also in Sociological Sciences. His specialties and expertise relate, of course, to prosecuting international crimes, investigating and interviewing in the context of war, the management of criminal justice, and combating the human rights violations that we see inside of Ukraine and elsewhere. He also holds extensive experience as a consultant and advisor in various human rights projects and programs. You have the floor, Yuri.
Thanks so much, dear Catriona, for this introduction. Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear partners, it's a pleasure for me to share with you results of our work in this sphere. And we're saying that let us switch to Ukrainian language and to continue in Ukrainian.
Dear colleagues, hello everyone. I'd like to briefly inform you about the result of the work of the Office of the Prosecutor General together with our partners, the State Security Service, the National Police, in the field of investigation of the crimes related to grain-related crimes, if you may call them that way. For all of you, it's very symbolic for Ukraine, this area of activity, because we all know that over a year ago, almost a year ago, the so-called three grains that laws that led to the destruction of people who starved to death because they were fully deprived of the times of subsistence, and the grain was the key substance for them, and they were deprived of that. And we have sort of a déjà vu now, where the descendants of Soviet power try to deprive Ukraine of the ways of subsistence by using almost the same or more advanced methods than compared to what they used 100 years back.
I will focus not only on attacks on the agricultural infrastructure, grain infrastructure, but I will also speak generally about crimes in respect of grain, since all these crimes are united by the sole intention, which is to steal, or if they are unable to do so, then to destroy the grain. And as you may imagine, the scale of these crimes is much bigger than one may suggest at first, and it goes beyond Ukrainian interest. I would want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to Catriona and to Vasil for having prepared the reports. Indeed, food security of many countries, especially on the African continent and in Asia, depend on Ukraine. In the meantime, we see Russia putting at risk the whole world by way of impeding Ukraine to actually cultivate and export agricultural goods, including grains. Right after the full-scale invasion, Russians would block the export of grains to other countries. For almost 6 months, there was no export at all, and only when the threat of hunger in many countries has become very realistic and promised to be actually strike these countries shortly, Russia accepted the grain agreement. However, it was still trying to manipulate, to somehow manually adjust the terms of agreement, and finally it reduced it to minimum at some moment in time. At some moment in time, it was completely blocked by Russia, and they started blackmailing Western countries. Once the SWIFT services were blocked in Russia, they started blackmailing Western countries and asking them to lift the restrictions so that Russia comes back to the terms of agreement. Then they were trying to blackmail Western countries in order to make them to unfreeze assets of Russian oligarchs. It led to nothing, and after that was when Ukraine started looking for other ways to export grain via other channels. Russia went down to complete to attacks aimed at actually at grain infrastructure and at just destructing this infrastructure, and there were attacks which included several strikes, up to 10 strikes. So the most affected were grain objects in Mykolaiv region and in other objects located in close proximity to hostilities. So once Ukraine rejected the humiliating terms of agreement that Russia was trying to impose, Russians started targeting also grain infrastructure, not only in eastern and southern regions, but also all over Ukraine. So they started using so-called Shahids, drones, in order to strike Ukrainian grains. So again, the ammunition used included a lot of various units, such as Iskanders, drones, ballistic missiles, tactic missiles, air-to-air missiles. So they would use various ammunition simultaneously in order to find weak points and in order to cause as much damage as possible. And it witnessed also of the intentional nature of such strikes, which leads us to understanding that it comes to a crime against humanity, and in the future, in some perspective, we may also expect to be able to prove some elements of genocide, because as you all know, genocide is an attempt to somehow target a particular group of people by various means, including by starving them to death. And for Ukraine, grain is of life importance. And again, not only in Ukraine, but also in other countries, especially in Africa and Asia, there are many people suffering from limited access to basic food, and they have started starving now. Now, a bit of statistics. The first thing we started focusing on, together with our colleagues from the Office of the Prosecutor General, was attacks on grains, stealing grains, destroying grains. So 37 people from among the collaborants were announced as suspects in stealing grains. So these are mostly people who remain in the occupied territories, and the amount of damage goes up to several billion hryvnias. Besides, there are 24 vessels which are being seized, unfortunately, again in absentia by Ukrainian courts, because these vessels were used for the transportation of grains stolen in the occupied Ukrainian territories. Speaking of global liability, which should be imposed on Russian leadership, we are now finalizing the respective investigations, and hopefully in some short perspective we will be able to give you names of people who should bear responsibility for these terrible crimes. Thank you.
Outline and really giving a sense of both impact inside of Ukraine and also on the wider scale of these attacks for food insecurity in areas where the breadbasket of Ukraine was so frequently used as the key export. We have 10 minutes if we're going to keep time, so I may just stick to 2 questions rather than questions for all of the panelists so that we can ensure that we finish on time. I think if I could go back, please, to the Minister, Mr. Derkach. Many of your questions, the questions that I had planned to ask, you've covered in your presentation. But just to keep the focus of the conference and this discussion on practical impacts, I wanted to ask, you talked about the impact of repair and the time that it would take to repair some of this critical infrastructure. And I wondered if you could give a sense, if you can, to the time and scale that we're looking at for the types of repairs that will be needed for this type of critical infrastructure, and what, if anything, other than the requests you made for further air support and air defense, that you would like to outline to the panelists, to the audience today.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, I think it's quite a difficult question in terms of the timing. Nobody can actually say the precise time, how much time we actually need to rebuild everything which was damaged. It definitely depends on the resources what we would have, and as I mentioned, it would be also very much it depends on the further attacks. So if we have actually closed the sky, and we might not have any other attacks on our port infrastructure, transport infrastructure. It definitely helps us to work with the recovery and reconstruction. We have also the huge issues with within the energy sector, within the hits that we have on our power plants, and that's actually very much influences recovery and reconstruction. It also influences right now the export of grain, because we need electricity for our infrastructure, for the elevators, for the warehouses. It's also bringing the cost up because of the transportation of grain and actually storage grain out of ports in very far away warehouses, and then also bring to us as the ministry the task to mitigate all the risks. And we are right now trying to digitalize all the processes in the ports and with the transport, actually to bring stuff to the port, get it out of the country. This is the main important issue. But coming back for the recovery and reconstruction, one most important issue is actually to close the sky. So new air defense, modern systems are very much needed. So this is the call for our international partners. Second issue is actually funds for their, as I mentioned, from the financial institutions actually to make it happen, to rebuild and reconstruct everything what was damaged. I would say very much also we are grateful for our private sector, because although Ukrainian companies, agricultural companies and logistical companies, they are basically recovering and repairing their stuff by themselves. So far, state doesn't have much money actually to give specifically for the private sector to rebuild and reconstruct the damages. The focus right now is for the citizens and for the housing and the other issues to be reconstructed and rebuilt. So the private sector, the big companies actually who has elevators, they are trying to rebuild them and not wait till the end of the war, regardless the fact that the risks are still there. So I would say altogether, with the international support, with the close air defense, I would say also with a strong actually diplomatic work and pressure to the aggressor, to Russia, not to hit on the critical infrastructure objects. Also, another issue is actually to our international partners to work together with us, to help us with the export of agricultural products. You remember several situations even in Ukrainian-Polish border last year, basically with the grain. That's also an issue, and this is the also which we need to speak about with our international partners, that we should be working as the one team altogether to make it happen, that the grain will hit the countries which are really in need. So that's basically our plan, how we will sustain the very, I would say, like comprehensive and effective export of grain for this year and for the following one.
Thank you very much for that answer. And I think maybe if I could ask one final question to Pascal, Mr. Toulan, if that's okay. You gave a very, as I said, an illuminating account of the different patterns. So talking from the timeline as such, from shelling to then the theft and then the transfer and appropriation of property, and that system and architecture that is around these types of attacks. And I wondered, through the work that you've done over the last 2 years with PEJ, if you could have any comments as to how you're shaping that type of architecture into indications of a policy, systematic or otherwise, or the intent from the Russian state. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So what we see, it's difficult to have, we have not identified one single pattern in the way that the pillage occurred in the different oblasts that we've seen, but only at the granular level. At the global level, the process is the same. So you have the entry of the military units in the country, they take over the territory, the kinetic operations, the military actions are what opens the way for them. The military units that are deployed in some of the areas, they take control over the premises, the lands, the places, and they immediately start stealing, selling, and if they cannot do it, they destroy and they move on. And when the whole oblast or an area is controlled, stabilized, if you wish, and there's an occupation that starts, then they start organizing this multi-layered administrative, civilian, military system to actually control the products, the equipment, the selling, and the export. So all of this, in our view, and from the evidence collected so far, is a system that is replicating in the different places, and that proceeds from a clear policy. The divergences, the differences we see at the local levels are because of the circumstances. So when it's not been possible to keep the occupation for long enough, or it also depends on the person. The way that Mr. Saldo, the governor of the Kherson occupied territory, behaves is not exactly the same as the way Mr. Balitsky from the Zaporizhia Oblast does it. And the companies are not exactly functioning the same. In Zaporizhia, it's a grain state operator, and they have a monopoly on everything. They took over all of the elevators, all of the fields, and they are able to impose their conditions. In Kherson, there's one Kherson grain company, but it also had to deal with other Russian private companies who stepped in. So it's not a monopoly, and it's a different way of doing it. But there is some degree of central control. There is at least, at the very least, at the beginning, a policy of laissez-faire from the military authorities on their units on the ground. And then after this, there is clearly a reference to a common system that's coming from the federal states. And the companies that are involved in this process, for instance, they are all registered in the Russian state register of companies. They are all there. And if you add to this the ongoing shelling, so the destructions now, or more recently, 2003, and then March and June and July 2024, or 2023, I meant, sorry, and 24, of the Odessa seaport, of the Reni and Ismail river ports, and the fact that you're depriving the Ukrainian of all export options and only making sure that your areas under your control and your grain will go out, that indicates a general pattern.
Thank you very much. I believe that is all we have time for. So I'd like to thank our distinguished experts for their time, and I hope we can continue this conversation going forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, distinguished panelists, for such a fruitful exchange of views. Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue the discussion in half an hour at 3:30 p.m. Thank you. Дякуємо учасникам минулої панелі за такий плідний обмін думками. Ми продовжимо нашу роботу о 15:30.